The clock above the fireplace at White's had just struck midnight when the dare was spoken. Lord Edmund Crewe set his glass down with the kind of careful slowness that meant he was far less composed than he appeared. He had spent the better part of 3 hours watching the Duke of Ashford win at cards, lose on purpose, then win again, all while wearing the expression of a man who had already decided the evening was not worth his full attention. Edmund hated that expression. He had hated it since they were boys at Eton, when Ashford had worn the same look during cricket and still somehow caught everything. "You're bored," Edmund said. The Duke of Ashford, whose full name was George Eliot Harman, 5th Duke of Ashford, Baron of Renfield, and a handful of other titles he never once used in conversation, did not deny this. "I've been bored since Tuesday," he said. He was 31 years old. He had dark hair that was never quite in order, eyes the color of old pewter, and a jaw that the portrait painters always struggled with because it suggested stubbornness even when he was at rest. He wore his clothes well without appearing to care about them, which was its own kind of art. 3 years ago he had been the second son, the spare, a man whose primary obligation to his family was simply to exist and cause no particular trouble. Then his brother had died and everything had changed, and Ashford had become the title, and the responsibility and the house and the weight. He did not speak of his brother. He spoke of almost nothing of importance, actually, which was why men like Edmund Crewe continued to find him interesting. A man who could be read was a man who could be managed. Ashford could not be read. "I have a proposal," Edmund said. Around them the club murmured and shifted. Candles burned low over green baize tables. 2 young barons argued about horse breeding in the corner with the seriousness of men discussing war. A fire cracked in the grate. The bet book sat on its stand near the door, as it always did, patient and waiting, the way all record keepers are patient and waiting. "Your proposals," Ashford said, "have historically cost me money. This one will cost you something better than money." Ashford turned his glass in a slow circle on the table. He looked at Edmund not with curiosity exactly, but with the specific attention of someone who has decided to be entertained. "Go on," he said. Edmund leaned forward. "There is a woman. There is always a woman in these proposals." "Not this kind of woman." Edmund picked up his own glass and did not drink from it. He was working out the exact words, which was unlike him. Edmund usually spoke before he thought. The fact that he was thinking now meant the words mattered to him. "Her name is Miss Ilara Voss. She arrived in London 6 weeks ago. Her father makes lace in Shropshire. She has no connections, no money worth mentioning, no title, no prospects. She is staying in lodgings on Cavendish Lane with her younger sister, and she has been quietly looking for work as a governess or a companion, neither of which she has found." Ashford waited. "The Ton," Edmund continued, "has taken notice of her only to agree that she is entirely unsuitable for anything except pity. This is a proposal involving pity. This is a proposal involving a dare." Edmund set his glass down again. "I dare you to marry her by morning." Silence of the kind that is not actually quiet. The fire continued to work. The barons continued to argue. Somewhere a chair scraped against the floor. Ashford said nothing for a long moment. "By morning," he repeated. "By morning," Edmund confirmed. "A licensed vicar, 2 witnesses, and your name on the register. If you do it, I will settle the Northfield matter in your favor and never mention it again. If you don't, you admit in writing in the bet book that I am the better man, which we both know will cost you considerably more than money." He had picked his terms carefully. The Northfield matter was a long and complicated disagreement over a shared boundary wall that had been irritating Ashford for 2 years. Edmund had the legal advantage and knew it, which he also knew Ashford knew. And the admission, the written admission, would sting because it was public, permanent, and absurd. Ashford looked at the bet book near the door. He thought about his brother briefly, the way he always thought about his brother, like pressing a bruise to check whether it still hurt. It did. It always did. Henry had been the one who would have laughed at this. Henry had been the one who would have grabbed a coat and gone. He stood up. Edmund blinked. "You're not seriously." "Send for a vicar," Ashford said. "I know a reliable one. He owes me a favor from the Cheltenham business." He straightened his coat. "And have someone write the terms in the book, properly. I want it witnessed." Edmund stared at him. "You're going to regret this," Edmund said. "Probably," Ashford agreed. "But I won't be bored." He walked to the door. and one of the club's footmen appeared as if from nowhere, the way good footmen always do, and Ashford told him what was needed. There was a small flurry of activity that the older members pretended not to notice, and the younger members watched with complete openness. And within 20 minutes a note had been sent to Reverend Gerald Alton on Dover Street, and the terms had been entered in the bet book in Edmund's handwriting and signed by Ashford in his own, and two other lords who had been sitting close enough to overhear had agreed to serve as witnesses in exchange for the story, which they knew would be worth telling for years. Ashford went outside and waited for his carriage. The night air was cold in the particular way of London in late October, which is damp and heavy rather than sharp, the kind of cold that settles into coats rather than cutting through them. He stood on the stone steps and looked at the street, at the lamplights reflected in the wet cobblestones, at a cat sitting perfectly still on a windowsill across the way. He thought, this is the most ridiculous thing I have ever done. He thought Henry would have done it in half the time. He got into the carriage when it came. Reverend Alton was located, roused, informed of the situation with minimum detail and maximum compensation, and collected from his front door wearing the expression of a man who had long ago decided that the habits of the wealthy were not his to judge. He was 60 years old, thin, and had conducted 240 marriages over his career, one of which had been performed on a boat, so the hour did not particularly trouble him. The carriage moved through empty streets toward Cavendish Lane. Ashford sat opposite the Reverend and looked at the window. The Reverend looked at his hands. "You know this young woman?" the Reverend asked. "No," Ashford said. The Reverend nodded slowly, the way old men nod when they are deciding not to say the thing they were thinking. "She knows you're coming," he tried. "She does not," Ashford said. The Reverend nodded again. Then he looked at the window too, and they rode in comfortable silence the rest of the way because there was nothing useful to add. Cavendish Lane was a quiet street of modest respectability. The houses were not grand, but they were kept. Window boxes still bright in the lamplight, doors painted dark colors. The address Ashford had obtained through the club's network of knowing young men was a narrow building, 3 stories, with a light still burning on the second floor. He noticed the light. Someone was awake. He knocked. There was a pause of perhaps 2 minutes, long enough for someone to hear, consider, and decide. Then footsteps on stairs, unhurried but deliberate, and the door opened. She was not what he had expected. He had not known what he had expected, which was already unusual for him. He was a man who formed expectations automatically, the way a body forms habits. He had expected nervousness, perhaps, or confusion, or the specific kind of worried face that people wore when a duke appeared on their doorstep at 1 in the morning. He had expected at some level the person Edmund had described, unsuitable, unremarkable, the kind of woman the Ton dismissed before finishing the sentence. She was wearing a plain grey housecoat, and her dark hair was down around her shoulders in the untidy way of someone who had been sleeping or reading rather than sitting for a portrait. She was not tall. She had dark eyes that in the lamplight looked almost black, and they were currently fixed on him with an expression he needed a moment to identify. It was not fear. It was not confusion. It was calculation. She looked at him, she looked at the Reverend. She looked at the 2 lords behind him, both of whom had come along out of pure interest, and were now standing on the pavement with the slightly guilty expressions of men who had not entirely thought through their attendance. She said, "You are the Duke of Ashford." It was not a question. "I am," he said. "You have a vicar with you," she said. "I do." She leaned against the doorframe, not in the relaxed way of someone at ease, but in the considering way of someone who is buying herself a moment of time. She looked at the Reverend again. The Reverend gave her a small, honest nod as if to say, "Yes, this is actually happening. Yes, I know, I agree, it is unusual." "What is the settlement?" she said. Ashford had prepared an answer to many possible responses. He had not specifically prepared for this one. He felt something move in his chest that he would not later be able to name properly. "That," he said, "is an excellent first question." She opened the door wider. "Then you had better come in," she said, "and explain what you're offering, and I will tell you whether it is enough." He stepped inside. Behind him, one of the lords murmured something to the other. The second lord murmured something back. Whatever it was, it contained the word extraordinary, spoken in a tone of genuine surprise. The house smelled of candle wax and something faintly sweet, possibly dried lavender. There was a small sitting room to the left of the narrow hall, and she led him into it without ceremony. A fire was burning low in the grate, barely more than coals. A book lay open on the chair nearest the window, face down, spine bent in the way that meant she had been reading it seriously, and not decoratively. She did not offer him tea. She sat in the chair nearest the fire, spine straight, hands in her lap, and looked at him. He sat across from her. The Reverend settled himself quietly near the door, hands folded, present but unintrusive. "You are George Harmon," she said, "Duke of Ashford. You came here tonight because of a dare. Lord Crewe was involved. I have been in London 6 weeks, and I already know that when Lord Crewe is involved in anything that happens after midnight, it is because he was trying to embarrass someone." Ashford looked at her carefully. "How do you know this?" "I hear things," she said simply. "I have been looking for work as a governess and as a companion, positions that require me to be present in rooms where people have conversations they do not think anyone important is listening to. I am frequently in those rooms." She paused. "You did not come here to embarrass me. You came because accepting the dare was more interesting than refusing it." He did not confirm or deny this. He said, "And you have not called for help or demanded that I leave." "Because," she said with the same directness, "I am listening to understand what you are offering before I decide what to do about it." She looked at her hands for a moment. "My sister has a debt. It is not enormous by your standards. By mine it is impossible. She has been ill. The doctors have been paid in promises which are now running out. If I do not resolve this within 3 weeks, the creditors will make it public, and she will have no chance of any decent future at all." She looked up. "So, what is the settlement?" He told her. She listened without interrupting, which was something he had not experienced often enough to take for granted. He told her the figure, the legal terms, the duration he was proposing for the marriage, a year at minimum, longer if necessary, and the allowance she would receive as his duchess. He told her the sister's debt would be cleared before the week was out, and her name would not appear in any document that could be found. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You would do this," she said carefully, "for a dare." "I would do this," he said, "because the dare was an excuse, and we both understand that." Something moved across her face. Not a smile exactly, but the shape of one, the suggestion of it, a thing that passed before it could be confirmed. "I have conditions," she said. "Of course you do," he said. They negotiated for 40 minutes. She was precise, she was careful. She was not intimidated, or if she was, she had arranged herself so perfectly that it made no visible difference. She asked about the household arrangements, about whether she would be expected to perform public duties and how many, about the specific terms of the financial agreement, and whether they would survive him. She asked about the possibility of amending the terms if circumstances changed. He answered all of it. He found, somewhere in the middle of the 20th minute, that he was paying closer attention than he usually paid to anything. At the end of the 40 minutes, she said, "There is one more thing." "Yes," he said. "My sister cannot know the full truth of this arrangement. She is 17 and she will worry. She will be told I made an excellent match through a mutual acquaintance." "That," he said, "is easily managed." She looked at him for a moment, not the calculating look of the first minutes, but something different, quieter, as if she were checking something internal, running a final count. "Then yes," she said, "I consent." She went upstairs for 7 minutes. She came back in a dress, hair pinned, with the speed of someone experienced in dressing without help, and she stood before the Reverend and said the words clearly and without hesitation. Ashford said them too. The clock on the small mantelpiece read 10 minutes before 3. When it was done and the register was signed, the Reverend shook both their hands with the calm of a man who had witnessed far stranger things, and let himself out with the 2 lords, who were already composing their morning letters in their heads. The room was very quiet. She looked at the register, where both their names now sat in permanent ink. He looked at the same place. "By morning," he said, half to himself. "Yes," she said. She did not sound frightened. She did not sound particularly triumphant either. She sounded, he thought, like someone who has just completed a very difficult calculation and found that the numbers balance, and is now waiting to see what happens next. He left before the clock struck 3. Outside, the night had gotten colder. The carriage was waiting. He got in and sat back and let the city move past the window, the dark streets, the occasional light, the silent buildings of a London that did not yet know what had happened inside that small house on Cavendish Lane. By morning it would know. By morning everything would be different. He was not, he noticed, bored. He also noticed that he had not thought about his brother since the sitting room. Both of these facts interested him, and he looked at them the way he had looked at her, carefully, without hurrying to a conclusion. The carriage moved on through the dark. The first thing Alara Voss did after the Duke of Ashford left her house was walk upstairs and check on her sister. Clara was asleep. She was always asleep by 10, because her body still demanded rest the way it had when she was recovering, even though the worst had passed. She lay curled on her side with one hand tucked under her cheek, and her dark hair spread across the pillow, 17 years old and entirely unaware that in the last 2 hours her sister had negotiated her way into the aristocracy. Alara stood in the doorway for a moment. The debt had been 3 weeks from ruin. Now it would be cleared before Saturday. She had extracted that promise in writing, signed by the Duke in front of the Reverend, which she had kept and folded into the small box under her floorboard where she kept the things that mattered most. His name in ink, her name beside it, the figure that represented Clara's future. She went back downstairs. She sat in the chair by the low fire and looked at the open book she had been reading before the knock at the door, and did not read a single word of it. She sat for perhaps an hour, looking at the page without seeing it, while her mind moved through what had just happened with the same methodical attention she gave to everything. She had grown up in Shropshire in a house that had been comfortable once and was careful now. Her father was a craftsman of the old type, precise and patient, and he had taught her the value of precision and patience, and also the fact that these virtues were rarely enough on their own. He had also taught her by example rather than instruction that the world was not arranged in a way that rewarded quiet capability in women, and that this was a fact to be navigated rather than mourned. She had come to London because the Shropshire opportunities for a woman of her position were limited to marriage or service, and she was not opposed to either, but she had wanted to choose, and choosing required options, and options required London. 6 weeks of London had provided her with a thorough education in the specific way doors did not open, and the specific way certain kinds of men looked through you rather than at you, and the specific way even kind employers paused when she listed her credentials, as if waiting for the part where a family name appeared. No family name had appeared. And then a duke had knocked on her door at 1 in the morning with a vicar, and she had made a decision in the space between hearing the knock and reaching the foot of the stairs. She had heard his name spoken at 2 separate gatherings she had attended as a companion. He was described as difficult. He was described as brilliant, which in her experience of London was how people described someone who would not be managed. He was described by one woman in particular as a man who has never needed to want anything, which makes him dangerous, because he is unimpressed by everything. She had filed that description away. She had not expected to use it. When she finally went to sleep, it was nearly 4 in the morning, and she slept 4 hours, and then she rose and dressed and went to wake Clara, because this was the morning she would need to explain, and she had decided exactly what she would say and in what order. Clara was not easy to wake. She came to consciousness slowly, surfacing through sleep like something rising through water, and Alara sat on the edge of the bed and waited. "I have something to tell you," Alara said, when her sister's eyes had opened sufficiently to take in the room. Clara blinked at her. She had their mother's eyes wide-set and honest. "What time is it?" "Just after 8, Alara said. "I need you to listen before you react." Clara pushed herself upright and looked at Alara properly. Something in Alara's posture communicated that this was not a small piece of news. Clara had known Alara for her entire life, and could read her the way you read a language you learned before you could remember learning it. "What happened?" Clara said. Alara told her. She told her the version she had constructed upstairs, a mutual acquaintance, a rapid courtship of which Clara had been unaware because Alara had not wanted to raise hopes, and an agreement reached the previous night. She did not use the word dare. She did not mention Lord Edmund Crewe or the bet book or Reverend Alton's coat, which had been buttoned incorrectly in his haste. Clara stared at her. "You got married," she said. "Yes, last night. Yes, to a duke." To the Duke of Ashford, yes. Clara opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Ilara. I know. You could have told me. I'm telling you now. Clara threw her arms around her sister's neck with the sudden intensity of a 17-year-old who has spent months watching her sister worry and has been pretending not to notice. Ilara held her and said nothing and let her be glad. They spent the morning packing. It was not a large undertaking, because they did not have large quantities of things, and this had always been Ilara's private humiliation, that she could fit everything that belonged to her into 3 cases without much effort. But she was efficient, and Clara helped with the energy of someone who had been told to move toward something better rather than away from something frightening. And by noon a carriage had arrived, arranged by the Duke's man of business, who introduced himself as Mr. Frederick Lane, and had the pleasant competence of someone who solved problems for a living and found the current problem well within his capabilities. Mr. Lane was perhaps 50, with grey at his temples and the particular quality of someone who had observed a great many unusual situations and maintained his equilibrium through all of them. He informed Ilara with careful formality that the household had been informed of her arrival, that her rooms had been prepared, and that the Duke was currently at his club in a meeting that had been arranged before last night's events and would return by 4. The household, Ilara said, how many? Mr. Lane told her. It was more people than she had ever managed in her life, and she did not say this. She said, thank you, and stepped into the carriage with Clara beside her and the 3 cases following in a second vehicle. Ashford House stood on a wide street in Mayfair, the kind of house that did not need to announce itself because its proportions announced it already. Tall white stone, 6 wide windows across the front of the upper floors, a door flanked by columns that were slightly unnecessary in the way that luxury often is. There was a small garden visible to the side, iron-railed and proper. Ilara looked at it through the carriage window. Clara said, oh. The housekeeper met them at the door. Her name was Mrs. Maud Farrow, and she was a woman of perhaps 55 who had worked in the house for 20 years and wore her long tenure like a second coat. She greeted Ilara with precisely the correct degree of deference, which is to say she greeted her exactly as a housekeeper should greet a new mistress of the house, with formal welcome and no warmth whatsoever. Ilara had expected this. She had expected worse, actually. She had spent the carriage ride cataloguing the ways a household could make a new arrival understand that she was not welcome, and Mrs. Farrow's cool formality was the gentlest version of the list. There was no rudeness. There was no eye movement that communicated anything Ilara could specifically object to. There was simply the impression of a woman who was waiting to see what this new person intended to do and had already prepared several opinions about it. Thank you, Mrs. Farrow, Ilara said. I would be grateful for a brief tour of the main rooms before I rest. I'd like to understand the house before I make any changes. Mrs. Farrow's eyebrows moved only slightly and only upward, which was the only sign she gave of being surprised. Of course, Your Grace, she said. The title was the first time anyone had used it, Your Grace. She filed it away and followed Mrs. Farrow through the house, and she paid attention to everything, the way the light fell in the rooms, which furniture had been recently moved and which had clearly not been touched in years, the small tells that a house leaves about who lives in it and how. The library, she noticed, had 2 armchairs pulled close to the fire. One of them had a slight depression in the seat that spoke of repeated use. The other was placed at an angle that suggested it had been added later, as if someone had occasionally wanted company but arranged it to be easy to remove again. The morning room had curtains that would be improved by being taken down and cleaned. The table in the dining room was long enough to seat 20 people, and had clearly been seating 1, based on the arrangement of the single-place setting that had been set and cleared so many times it had established its own worn path on the tablecloth. She asked Mrs. Farrow about the household schedule. Mrs. Farrow told her. She asked about the kitchen staff and the current provisioning arrangements. Mrs. Farrow told her, in a tone that was elaborately neutral. She asked whether the upstairs sitting room was typically used. Not since his late Grace's time, Mrs. Farrow said, and stopped and then added formally, the late Duke's mother, who passed 3 years ago. I see, Ilara said. She did not ask about the other late Grace, the brother. She had heard enough of the Duke in 6 weeks of London to know that his brother's death was a subject that did not receive direct inquiry. Clara was settled in a room on the 2nd floor that looked out over the garden. She stood at the window for a long time looking at it with the expression of someone who has been given something they were afraid to hope for. Elara went to her own rooms, which were larger and more quietly formal, and she sat at the writing desk and looked at the room and thought about what she had walked into. She had walked into debt cleared. She had walked into safety secured. She had walked into a title that would open doors for Clara that had been closed to them both since birth. These were the calculations she had made in 40 minutes of negotiation, and she stood by them. What she had not fully calculated was this: the house was not empty the way she had imagined it would be empty. It was full of a person who was not present yet. Every room contained evidence of him, the books left open, the arrangement of chairs, the single-place setting, the rooms that had not been changed because no one had been there to change them. She had walked into someone's life, and that was different from walking into a legal arrangement. She was still sitting at the desk when she heard the front door. She heard his voice below in the hall, speaking to Mr. Lane, and then footsteps on the stairs. And then the house shifted in the small way that a house shifts when the person who belongs to it returns. She stayed at the desk. She had decided she would not go to the door of her room. She was not going to perform eagerness or anxiety. If he wanted to speak to her, he knew where she was. If he did not, the evening would handle itself. The footsteps paused outside the door. There was a knock. "Come in," she said. He opened the door and stood in it. He looked, in the honest light of an afternoon in her rooms, like someone who had slept less than was advisable and was not particularly bothered by this. He looked at her at the desk, at the room that was now nominally hers, at the small arrangement of her things that she had placed on the desk: a pen, a notebook, the small painted portrait of her parents. "The house is yours to manage as you see fit," he said. "Mrs. Farrow will tell you otherwise until she decides she won't, and that will take approximately 3 weeks. "I suspected something like that," she said. He looked at the portrait. "Your parents?" "Yes." He said nothing for a moment. Then, "Dinner is at 7. It is not a fixed requirement. You may change it if it suits you." "Does it suit you?" she asked. He seemed very slightly surprised by the question. "7 is fine," he said. "Then 7, she said. "I have no reason to change it." He nodded. He looked as though he was going to say something else, and then decided against it, and then made a decision of a different kind. "She is settling in," he said. "Your sister." Something moved in Elara's chest, unexpected, small, quick. "She is," Elara said. "She is looking at the garden." "There are roses along the east wall," he said. "In spring she might like to know." He said it in the same way he said everything, without particular expression, as if he were reporting information and not being kind. But it was kind. She recognized kindness even when it was wearing other clothes. "I will tell her," she said. He nodded again and left. She turned back to the desk. She had made the calculation in 40 minutes. The calculation was correct. The settlement was fair, the terms were clear, the arrangement was solid. She had not calculated for the roses along the east wall. She wrote that down in her notebook, under a column she had not intended to create and did not yet have a name for. Then she closed the notebook and went to tell Clara about the roses. London found out on a Tuesday. This was not a coincidence. Information of a social nature in London always landed on a Tuesday, because Sunday was for church and reflection, Monday was for recovering from Sunday's reflection, and by Tuesday the city was properly awake and ready to be outraged or delighted, preferably both at once. The Morning Post on that Tuesday carried 3 different accounts of the marriage in 3 different publications, each version slightly different in its details and absolutely uniform in its conclusion. The Duke of Ashford, one of the most eligible men in England, had married a nobody from Shropshire in the middle of the night on the strength of a dare entered in the bet book at White's, and the nobody in question was now the Duchess of Ashford, which was either the most brilliant social coup in a generation or the most ridiculous thing that had happened in London since Lord Bale's famous incident with the opera singer and the fountain, depending on who was telling the story. Elara read 2 of the 3 accounts over breakfast. She read them carefully, the way she read everything, and she noted the specific phrases used to describe her: a woman of no particular consequence, entirely without connections, a lacemaker's daughter recently arrived from the country. She noted that the accounts described the dare in detail and her settlement not at all. She noted that the Duke of Ashford was described as eccentric and impulsive, both of which, she suspected, were words people used for him when they meant to say something less polite. She set the papers down and asked Mrs. Farrow for more tea. Mrs. Farrow brought it without comment, but with the faint air of someone who has already read the papers and has thoughts that she is professionally obligated not to express. Clara was at the table across from her, still in the first bright hours of being a person who lived in a house like this and had not yet begun to take it for granted. "They're writing about you," Clara said, nodding at the papers. "They're writing about the story," Alara said. "There is a difference." Clara considered this. "Does it bother you?" "Not particularly," Alara said, and found, examining the statement, that it was mostly true. What she felt about the papers was not discomfort but calculation. These accounts would determine how London received her. They would set the frame through which every subsequent interaction would be interpreted. That was information she could use. "Will people call?" Clara asked. "Some will," Alara said. "Some will call to be kind. More will call to look." The first call arrived that afternoon. Her name was Lady Constance Ray, and she was perhaps 45, with the kind of assured beauty that had survived its youth and was now something more interesting, all fine bones and sharp observation. She sat across from Alara in the front drawing room. Alara had chosen the front drawing room deliberately, because it was the most formal room in the house, and formality put visitors on the same footing as the person receiving them. And she looked at Alara the way someone looks at a puzzle they have decided to like before they have fully worked it out. "I wanted to see you before the others," Lady Constance said. She said it pleasantly, as a fact, not an apology. "I suspected," Alara said. "You don't seem frightened," Lady Constance said. "I'm not," Alara said. "Should I be?" Lady Constance smiled. It was a genuine smile which surprised Alara slightly. Most women in your position would be. The Tun is not kind to sudden arrivals, particularly sudden arrivals who acquire a dukedom overnight. "I understand that," Alara said. "I also understand that the Tun has no particular standing to judge how I arrived here, since it plays no part in the arrangement." There was a brief quiet, during which Lady Constance looked at her with the smile still in place, but the eyes doing something more serious behind it. "You're going to be interesting," she said. "I'm glad I came early." "Would you like more tea?" Alara said. The second call was less pleasant. The Duchess of Pembroke arrived at 3:30, which Alara would later understand was a specific choice, because calling after the most natural visiting hour was its own kind of social maneuver, a way of arriving when the hostess might be tired and less defended. The Duchess of Pembroke was perhaps 60, with the rigid carriage of someone who had spent decades believing that posture was a moral quality. She sat in the chair that Lady Constance had occupied an hour earlier and looked at the room with the expression of a woman performing a thorough inspection without moving her head. "Ashford House," she said by way of greeting, "has not had a proper mistress in some years." "It has one now," Alara said. The Duchess of Pembroke looked at her. "Yes," she said. "So the papers tell us." She paused. "We were all very surprised." "I imagine you were," Alara said. "The Duke is a man of considerable." The Duchess searched for the word with the patience of someone who already knew the word and was deciding whether to use the polite version or the accurate one. "Impulse," she settled on. "He acts before he considers. He always has." "That has not been my experience of him," Alara said. The Duchess looked at her again. "You have known him for rather less time than most of us." "Quite possibly," Alara said. "But length of acquaintance and quality of observation are different measures, and I find I am better at the second than many people expect." There was a silence of the kind that the Duchess of Pembroke used to make younger women feel that they had said the wrong thing. Alara sat through it without adjusting her expression. "You will find," the Duchess said at last, "that London has very particular opinions." "London," Alara said pleasantly, "is welcome to them." The Duchess left shortly after. In the hallway, where Alara was not quite close enough to overhear, and was therefore close enough to catch the outline, the Duchess said something to her companion in a low voice. The companion glanced back at the drawing-room door with an expression Alara caught in the hall mirror, not contempt, but something closer to reluctant reassessment. She filed this away. By the time the Duke returned at 5 o'clock, The house had received 7 calls. Ilara had made notes on each one, not in the front drawing room where they might be seen, but in her head, in the efficient filing system she had built over years of being in rooms where being forgotten was occasionally useful. She gave him the summary over dinner. They had, in the 4 days since the marriage, established an accidental routine. Dinner at 7, initially in the formal silence of 2 strangers managing a shared space, and then, somewhere in the second evening, conversation. It had started because she had said something about Hobbes and he had disagreed, and they had disagreed about it for the better part of 2 courses in the particular way of people who are actually enjoying the disagreement. Tonight she told him about the calls. He listened, he was good at listening, she had noticed, in the specific way of someone who was not merely waiting to speak. Lady Constance, he said, when she described the first call. She seems worth knowing, Ilara said. She is, he said. She was kind to my brother once when others were not. He said it carefully, a piece of information placed with intention, and then he picked up his wine glass and let the moment pass. She let it pass with him. The Duchess of Pembroke, he said, when she described the second call. She has opinions about impulse, Ilara said. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was related to one. She has been saying that I act on impulse since I was 19, when I refused a match she had been engineering for 3 years. Who was the match? He looked at her. Her niece, he said, a pleasant woman who wanted very much to be a duchess and was entirely unsuitable for the rest of it. The rest of what? He held his wine glass for a moment. The conversation, he said, the argument, the 40-minute negotiation. He looked at his plate. Most people do not negotiate with me. Most people do not have a reason to, she said. You negotiated with me because I had something you needed. You had something I didn't know I needed, he said. She wasn't sure what to do with that sentence, so she moved past it. There will be an opera, she said, next Thursday. I have received 2 separate invitations today, which I believe is the Tun's way of indicating that my public appearance is being anticipated. I'm aware, he said. Crewe will be there. He always attends the opera on the first Thursday. It is the one social obligation he keeps without fail because he considers his box the best position in the house from which to observe everyone else. Do you want me to attend? She asked. He looked at her directly. Do you want to attend? I want to understand what we are doing in public, she said. We have said almost nothing about this. I know the legal terms, I know the settlement. I don't know what we are supposed to look like to the people watching. He was quiet for a moment. We could look like ourselves, he said, and let them interpret it. That is either a very good strategy or a very vague one, she said. Yes, he agreed. She looked at him across the long table, his single candle and her single candle making 2 separate pools of light in the enormous dining room. We need to be closer together at this table, she said. It looks ridiculous, eating at opposite ends of a room this size. He looked the length of the table, he looked at his place setting, he looked at hers. Yes, he said again, but this time he said it differently, and she was not entirely sure what he meant by it. The following Thursday came with a cold, clear sky and half of London's opinion pressed into the opera house, with the intensity of people who had been waiting all week for a curtain to go up. It was not the curtain on the stage that interested them. She wore dark blue because it was what she had that was appropriate, and she had spent an hour with Clara's help on her hair, and she had decided before she arrived that she would not look nervous, because she was not nervous, because nervousness was only useful if you had something to protect, and she had already decided that the one thing she would not protect in public was her dignity. They were shown to his box. The opera house had a particular architecture that made every box visible to every other box, which was, she understood now, entirely the point. The room was built for people to watch each other while pretending to watch the stage. Every pair of eyes in the room made a subtle adjustment when they entered. She felt it without looking at it, a change in the quality of attention in the air, a redirecting. She sat beside the Duke and looked at the stage and did not look around the room. Beside her he said very quietly, Crewe is in the box directly across. She kept her eyes on the stage. I know, she said. He came in 11 minutes ago, the box on the second level center left, his coat is too new. A brief quiet. You noticed that before we sat down, he said. I notice most things before I sit down, she said. It is more useful to look while you are still moving. Another silence shorter than the last. You are, he said quietly, in a tone that was very different from his usual tone, absolutely nothing like what I expected. She turned and looked at him. He was watching her with an expression she had not seen on him before, not the Duke's face, the public one that gave nothing away, something more direct than that, unguarded, which on him was so unusual it changed the whole shape of his face. What did you expect? She said. He looked back at the stage. I'm not sure, he said. But not this. Across the opera house, Lord Edmund Crewe watched the Duke of Ashford's box through a very small pair of opera glasses that he thought no one could see. What he saw made the back of his neck go warm in the particular way that envy does when it arrives before you have named it. He lowered the glasses. The opera was very good that evening. He did not enjoy it at all. On the morning of the 9th day, Alara changed the morning room. It was not a dramatic change. She did not remove furniture or strip the walls. She moved the writing desk 18 inches to the left so that whoever sat at it would have the light from the window rather than their back to it. She had the curtains taken down and sent to the laundry because they smelled of years of a room that was never fully opened, and she replaced them temporarily with the thinner curtains from the store cupboard while the heavy ones were cleaned. She moved a chair that had been sitting at an odd angle, which she suspected had been placed there to avoid a wobble in one of the floorboards, and confirmed the wobble and asked a footman to look into it. She was working out how to arrange the small bookshelf near the door when Mrs. Farrow appeared in the doorway. Mrs. Farrow looked at the desk in its new position. She looked at the curtains. She looked at the chair. She said nothing for a long moment, in the specific way of a woman who has 21 years of opinions about a room and is deciding how to carry them. The desk light is better there, Alara said, without turning around. She was examining the bookshelf, which held a combination of books that had been placed there decoratively rather than read, and books that had clearly been placed there because someone ran out of room elsewhere. She was sorting them by the second category, which interested her more. The desk has always been positioned near the window, Mrs. Farrow said. It was near the window, Alara said. Now it faces the window, there's a distinction. She found a book of maps tucked behind a novel that had never been opened. She pulled it out. Do you know whose this was? Mrs. Farrow came into the room just slightly. She looked at the book. His late brother's, she said. Master Henry, he liked maps. Something passed across her face when she said the name. Not grief exactly, because grief in Mrs. Farrow would have been private, but something, a softening. I'll put it in the library, Alara said, with his other things if he had others there. He had a shelf, Mrs. Farrow said, the middle of the 3 south windows. Good, Alara said. She set the map book aside and returned to the bookshelf, and after a moment Mrs. Farrow did not leave. She did not offer to help, but she stayed in the doorway in a way that had changed from the guarding stance she had held for the first 9 days to something more watchful than oppositional. Alara did not remark on this. She simply continued sorting the books, and after a few minutes she said without looking up, "What was this room used for, before?" "Morning calls," Mrs. Farrow said. "When His Grace's mother was alive she received here. After she passed it was not much used." "How long has it been unused?" 3 years, mostly." Alara looked around the room. 3 years of careful maintenance without use, which was a particular kind of sadness, the preservation of a space for a purpose that no longer existed. "It will be used now," she said. "I will take breakfast here in the mornings and manage correspondence here in the afternoons. If the Duke wishes to use it for other purposes, we'll arrange accordingly, but it seems foolish to maintain a room and then keep it empty." Mrs. Farrow looked at the desk in its new position again. "The light is better there," she said. It was not a capitulation. It was more like a piece of information that happened to agree with what Alara had already said. "Yes," Alara said, "it is." The Duke's schedule was not mysterious to her. She had learned it in the first week without asking directly, which was her preferred method of learning anything. He rose early, breakfasted alone in the small dining room, left for his club or his solicitor or the House of Lords before 9, returned at 5 or 6, dined at 7, and spent the evening hours in the library. He read seriously and well, which she had determined from the condition of the books. and he had a habit of leaving whatever he was reading open on the arm of the chair when he finished for the night, as if he intended to return to it and simply had not gotten around to it yet. She had started leaving her own book on the other arm of the other chair. She was not certain when this had become a custom. It had not been decided. One evening she had been reading in the library when he came in, and she had stayed, and they had read in companionable silence until she went to bed, and the following evening the same, and then the evening after that, until it was simply what they did. He had not mentioned it, she had not mentioned it. On the 10th day, he noticed the map book on the library shelf. She was not in the library when he found it. She heard rather than saw his footsteps pause in the middle of the room, and she heard the silence that followed, which was different from the silence of a man looking at a book, and the same as the silence of a man who has found something he was not prepared to find. She had gone back to her own rooms to write letters. At dinner that evening he said, "You found Henry's map book." "In the morning room," she said. "I thought it should be with his other things." He looked at his plate for a moment. "He bought it in Edinburgh," he said. "He went up for 3 weeks during his last year at university, against my father's advice, and came back with the maps and an enthusiasm for Scotland that lasted about 4 months before London replaced it." He said it in the careful way of someone who was testing whether the ground would hold the weight of the memory. "It held. 4 months of Scottish enthusiasm," she said. "What did that look like?" He looked up at her, something shifted. He attempted porridge for breakfast every morning for 6 weeks. The cook was beside herself. A pause. He was also convinced that the Scottish system of law was superior to the English one in every respect, which he argued at every dinner table he attended, until people started declining to seat him next to the lawyers. She could hear the shape of the brother in those details. Not the official shape, the quiet acceptable grief that was all anyone in London let themselves show, but the actual person, laughing and inconvenient and interested in the wrong things at the wrong moments. "He sounds exhausting," she said. "He was," he said, "terribly, embarrassingly so. A beat in which something moved across his face and did not stay. He would have liked you enormously." She did not say anything to that. He did not either. They finished dinner. On the 12th day, she reorganized the dining table. This was a significant change, and she had thought about it carefully before she did it. The table was long enough to seat 20. They sat at opposite ends of it, which she had mentioned 2 weeks ago and he had agreed about, and nothing had changed, because neither of them had changed it, which was its own kind of statement. She moved the place settings. She did not make them adjacent, because that would be performing a closeness they had not yet established. She put them at one end of the table, hers at the head and his to the right, so that the conversation did not have to travel across 8 feet of empty table and linen to arrive. He came to dinner at 7 and looked at the table and looked at her and said nothing, and sat in the chair at her right. "Better," he said. "Much better," she said. They began with a disagreement about the Reform Bill, which neither of them resolved, and continued with a debate about whether history was better understood through primary documents or secondary analysis, which she argued against and he argued for, and neither of them was entirely right, and both of them knew it, and this made the conversation more interesting rather than less. At some point she laughed at something he said. She noticed this afterward, not during, the way you notice afterward that you walked across a room you were afraid of. She had laughed without calculating it. It had simply happened. He had laughed too, a real one, not the polite social noise but an actual sound, surprised out of him, and he had covered it with his wine glass in the way of someone performing casualness as a reflex. She noticed that too. That evening in the library she picked up her book and he picked up his and they read in silence for an hour, and the fire worked down, and at some point she realized that she was not reading at all but simply sitting in a room that felt, despite everything she knew about how she had arrived in it, like a place she was allowed to be. She found this interesting. She found him interesting, which was more disquieting, because she had told herself at the beginning that interest was not part of the arrangement. Interest was not in the settlement terms. Interest complicated the arithmetic. She added it to her notebook, under the column she had started and had still not named. Then she read 2 more pages and went to bed. On the 15th day, she heard him in the hallway outside the room that was kept locked. She had noticed the room on the 2nd floor on her first day, A door that did not match the others, slightly heavier, with a lock rather than a simple handle latch. She had not asked about it. There were things a household kept private, and she had already decided that she would not take more space than she was offered. Not yet. She was passing through the hall on her way to the upstairs sitting room when she heard him stop outside the door. He stood there for a moment. He did not put his hand to the lock. He simply stood there, and the silence around him was a specific kind of silence that she recognized from the early days in her father's house, when there was something wrong that no one could fix, and everyone moved around it carefully, pretending the thing was not there. She passed him in the hall and said, "The east garden looks well this morning." He turned from the door. "Does it?" he said, as if returning from somewhere far away. "The roses along that wall," she said. "Clara has been drawing them." Something loosened in his face. "Has she?" he said, not quite a question. "She is quite good," Alara said. "She has been drawing things since she could hold a pencil." He looked at the hall, at the wall where a portrait of some earlier duke gazed down with the self-possession of people who never question their right to have portraits done. "There are more roses in the back garden," he said. "A full arbor, it's best in late June." "I'll tell her," she said. She continued down the hall. Behind her, she heard him walk away from the locked door, back toward the stairs, back toward the part of the house where life continued. She had told him about the garden. He had told her about the arbor. She did not know what was behind the locked door. She suspected she would eventually. She had noticed that he was a man who had decided to carry things alone, and she had noticed that carrying things alone was something she did too, and she had also noticed that two people who carry things alone, put in close proximity over enough dinners and enough evenings by a library fire, sometimes began, without intending it, to set things down. Not because they had decided to. Because there is only so long you can hold something before your hands simply open. She went to the sitting room and wrote 3 letters and thought about this, and when she was done she added a final note to the column without a name, and this time she almost named it, but she did not, because she was not quite ready for it yet. The Haverton ball was on a Friday, which was the worst possible night for it, because by Friday London had spent a full week accumulating opinions, and was desperately in need of a social occasion through which to distribute them. Invitation had arrived 10 days earlier. Alara had looked at it and known, from the address and the name and the particular weight of the envelope, that this was not merely a ball, it was an assessment. The Havertons held the most attended winter ball in London, and the most attended thing in London during the social season functioned as a kind of unofficial court, where arrivals were noted and departures analyzed, and every conversation between was subject to interpretation before the evening ended. She told him at dinner. He said, "I know," in the way he said things when he already knew but was waiting to see how she approached them. "We should go," she said. "Yes," he said. "And we should go as though there is nothing unusual about attending," she said. "Not performing ease, actually being at ease." He looked at her across the corner of the table. "Is there a difference?" "A significant one," she said. "Performed ease has a quality people can smell like cheap wax." He was quiet for a moment, then, "And are you at ease?" She considered this honestly. "More than I expected to be," she said. He nodded slowly. He said almost to himself, "So am I." Neither of them said anything for a moment after that. The night of the ball was cold enough to make the carriage windows fog slightly. Alara sat across from him and Clara, who had been invited on her insistence, because Clara deserved to see the inside of a Haverton ball at least once, even if she spent the evening in the ladies' sitting room reading. And the 3 of them rode through the streets in a configuration that would have seemed unusual 5 weeks ago, and now simply seemed like an evening. The house was lit from within, every window glowing, the street outside crowded with carriages unloading people in expensive clothes. Alara watched through the foggy window and arranged herself, posture, expression, the quality of attention she would bring into the room. She had learned in 6 weeks of London as a person without position how to make herself invisible. She had sat in rooms and been overlooked with such consistency that she had begun to understand the mechanics of it, the way a certain kind of stillness, and a certain kind of dress, and a certain kind of downward glance combined to make a person fade into the background of any room they occupied. Tonight she intended to do the opposite. Not spectacularly, not aggressively. She had no interest in performance for its own sake. but she had thought about what her presence at this ball meant, and she had decided that the best thing she could do was simply be present in it, fully, without apology, as a person who believed she had every right to be there because she had negotiated carefully for exactly that right. Inside the Haverton house, the rooms were warm and overfull in the way of a successful ball, which is a specific kind of heat composed of candles and proximity, and the shared energy of several hundred people who have spent all week looking forward to this. They entered together. The shift in attention was immediate, not dramatic. There was no hush or turning of heads in unison, because this was a sophisticated crowd and sophistication required that one's notice of a notable arrival be communicated through small signals rather than obvious ones. A glance toward a door and quickly away, a slight leaning of one conversation partner toward another, the subtle realignment of a room's center of gravity. She felt it all. She looked at the room and let it look back. Across the ballroom, she located Lord Edmund Crewe without appearing to search. He was standing near the far window with 3 other men she did not recognize, and he was holding his drink at an angle that suggested he was in the middle of a sentence when he saw them enter and had not quite finished it. He recovered quickly because he was practiced, but the recovery itself was visible if you were looking, and she was looking. "Crewe," she said quietly to the Duke. "I see him," he said. "He didn't expect us to come," she said. "He never expects people to do the things he bet against," the Duke said. "It's why his record at White's is so inconsistent." She almost smiled. Lady Constance found her within the first 20 minutes, which she had predicted, because Lady Constance was a woman who positioned herself to see everything, and therefore was always approximately where the interesting thing was happening. "You look entirely unbothered," Lady Constance said. She said it with satisfaction, as if Elara were a solution she had arrived at. "I am entirely unbothered," Elara said. "Lord Crewe has been talking," Lady Constance said. "What has he been saying?" "That the Duke was manipulated, that the whole arrangement was engineered." Lady Constance took a glass from a passing tray and held it without drinking. "That you took advantage of an impulsive man." Elara looked at Lord Crewe across the room. "Lord Crewe," she said, "said a dare that he expected the Duke to refuse. The Duke did not refuse it. I believe what bothers him is not that the Duke was manipulated, but that he himself was outmaneuvered." Lady Constance looked at her with the expression she had worn on the first call, the puzzle she had decided to like before working it out. "Yes," she said, "that is precisely what bothers him." They smiled at each other, the way women do when they are in agreement about something too precise to be said plainly in a ballroom. The dancing began at 9. She had expected to observe rather than participate. She had the steps her mother had taught her, a long time ago in the parlor in Shropshire, on a rainy Saturday with no particular purpose other than that her mother believed dancing was something a woman should know. But she had not danced in anything like this company, and she was prepared to stand near the edge and take her time. She was not given the opportunity. Lord Edmund Crewe appeared beside her, while the Duke was speaking to someone at the other side of the room. "Your Grace," he said. He said the title with the slightest hesitation, the pause of a man who finds the words acceptable but distasteful. "Lord Crewe," she said. He looked at her with the careful attention of a man trying to locate something. She was not certain what he was looking for, evidence perhaps. A crack in the surface he could lever open. "You are settling in well," he said, with the tone of a man who means the opposite. "Very well, thank you," she said. "Ashford House is not an easy house," he said. "I find most things manageable if you simply begin," she said. He looked at her. "He will grow bored," he said. It was quiet enough that no one near them could hear. "It is what he does. He takes something up and then he is done with it. It is not a fault exactly. It is simply his nature." She looked at him with the same directness that had been her single most reliable tool since she arrived in London. "If you will excuse me," she said, without responding to what he had said, because responding would have given it weight, and it did not deserve weight. She moved away. And the Duke, who had turned from his conversation at that particular moment, watched her cross the floor from Crewe's vicinity with the expression of a man doing arithmetic. He was at her side in 4 steps. "What did he say?" he said. "Nothing worth repeating," she said. He looked across the room at Crewe. His expression was the calm that precedes decisions rather than the calm that follows them. "Do you dance?" he said. She looked up at him, slightly surprised. "Yes," she said, "do you?" "When I have a reason," he said. She put her hand on his arm. They walked to the floor. She had danced with her mother in a Shropshire parlour on rainy Saturdays, and she had danced at 2 small country gatherings, and she had never danced in a room this size with this many eyes on her. The steps were familiar, the scale was not. He danced well, not performatively, but with the ease of someone who had done it enough times that the mechanics required no attention, which freed the attention for other things. He bent toward her at some point in the second figure and said something near her ear. It was not the kind of thing one usually says in a ballroom. It was something specific about Crewe and the Northfield boundary wall and a particular legal precedent that she had not been aware of, and it was the driest possible observation, entirely out of place in a ballroom, and she tilted her head and laughed before she could prevent it. He was watching her when she recovered. He had the expression she had seen once before in the opera house, that unguarded thing, the ducal face briefly set aside. "You laughed," he said. "You were funny," she said. "I am rarely funny," he said. "I am told I am dry." "Dry can be funny," she said, "in the right ears." He looked at her for a moment. "You have," he said carefully, "the right ears." She did not know what to do with that either. She filed it, as she filed everything in the column without a name. At the edge of the ballroom she was dimly aware of people watching. Of Lady Constance, who was watching with satisfaction. Of the Duchess of Pembroke, who was watching with the particular expression of someone revising an opinion and not enjoying the process. Of 3 young lords near the door who were watching with the undisguised interest of men, observing something they cannot quite account for. And of Lord Edmund Crewe, who was watching from his position near the window, and whose expression was not angry and was not dismissive but was something more complicated than either. The expression of a man who set a trap and watched someone walk into it and come out the other side better than they went in, and who is only now beginning to understand what he actually lost. Later in the carriage home, Clara fell asleep between them on the seat. She had managed 3 hours before exhaustion won, and the city moved past the fogged windows again, and Alara sat with her sister's head on her shoulder and looked at the passing lamplights. He was across from her. She could feel him looking at her, not with the observational attention of the first nights, but differently. "The ball was successful," she said, without looking away from the window. "By any measure," he said. "Crewe will recalibrate," she said. "He will," he agreed. A pause. "What he said to you," the Duke said, "it was about me." She looked at him now. "It was about the arrangement," she said. "The same thing," he said. She held his gaze. "He is wrong," she said, and she did not say anything further, and he did not press her, and the carriage moved through the dark streets toward Ashford House, and Clara slept between them, entirely unaware of the conversation on both sides of her, and Alara looked back at the window and pressed her fingers against the cold glass and thought about a column in a notebook that she had still not named. She named it that night. She did not write the name down. She simply knew it, the way you know some things, not by arriving at them through calculation, but by looking up one evening and finding that they have been true for some time. She did not know what to do with it yet. She would work that out. She worked everything out, eventually. The letter arrived on a Wednesday, addressed to Alara Voss, not Alara Harmon, Duchess of Ashford. The handwriting on the outer envelope was small and precise, the kind of handwriting produced by a person who had learned to make every letter count because paper was not cheap. She recognized it before she saw the return address. She recognized it the way you recognize a sound you hope not to hear again. It was from the man to whom Clara's debt had been owed. His name was Philip Galt, and he was not a creditor in the traditional sense. He was more precisely the man who had lent a large sum to a minor gentleman in Shropshire who had since died, and who had then sold the outstanding debt to a series of other parties, and who had ended up, through a chain of transactions that Alara had never fully been able to trace, with a claim against her sister that was legally ambiguous but socially dangerous. The debt had been cleared. She had Mr. Lane's confirmation in writing, signed and dated. The specific figure, transferred from the Duke of Ashford's account through proper channels, had settled the matter before the end of the first week. She opened the letter. It was brief. Galt wished to congratulate her on her recent marriage. He noted that it had been well reported in the papers. He observed that the settlement of the prior debt had been received and was not in question. He then noted, with the elaborate courtesy of a man sharpening a knife, that he had been in correspondence with a cousin in London who had recently met Miss Clara Voss at a social gathering, and that this cousin had mentioned certain details about the circumstances of Miss Clara's illness, details which Galt had always thought were the private business of the family, and which he hoped would remain so, as such details were of no benefit to anyone once they were made general knowledge. He closed by expressing his continued warmth toward the family and his sincere hope that they were settling comfortably into their new circumstances. Ilara read the letter twice. She folded it. She placed it on the desk. She sat for exactly 3 minutes with her hands flat on the surface of the desk, feeling the wood grain under her palms, and she did not move. Then she went downstairs. She was at the foot of the stairs when she heard Clara in the morning room talking to one of the housemaids about the roses she had been sketching. She heard Clara laugh at something the housemaid said. It was a light sound, uncomplicated, the laugh of a person who currently believes the world is manageable. Ilara went to the library. She sat in the chair she used for reading and did not read anything. What Galt had sent was not technically a threat. It was an observation dressed in the language of goodwill. But she understood what it was with the same clarity that she understood anything, completely, on first reading, without the need for a second pass. He was informing her that he knew something about Clara that could be damaging if released, and that his continued silence was contingent on her continued awareness of this. He had not stated his terms. This was the most sophisticated part of the letter. By not stating his terms, he forced her to wonder what they were, and wondering was more exhausting than knowing. He was telling her he existed, that he had access, that he was watching, and he was leaving the rest of it open so that her imagination could work on her through the night. She had been managing things alone for a long time. She had managed the original debt alone, when Clara first became ill and the bills began to arrive and their father had already passed and there was no one else. She had managed the 6 weeks in London alone, the search for work, the careful economy of the lodgings on Cavendish Lane, the calculation that had led to the marriage. She had always managed alone because alone was the mode available to her. She sat in the library chair and looked at the fire and thought about what alone cost. She was still there when he came in at 5:30. He looked at her in the chair, which was her chair now in the sense that it had been hers for a month, and habit is the fastest form of ownership. He looked at her expression, which she had arranged into neutrality but which she suspected was not quite achieving it. He said nothing. He put his coat over the back of the other chair and sat in it and looked at the fire. After a moment she said, "I received a letter today." "I know," he said. She looked at him. "Lane intercepted a letter at the door this morning," he said. "He recognized the return address. He brought it to me." He looked at the fire steadily. "Galt has been attempting to extract money from the Ashford estate accounts for 3 months on a separate matter entirely, a property claim in Essex that has no legal standing. Lane has been managing it." She was quiet for a moment. "You knew about him," she said. "I knew about the Essex claim," he said. "I did not connect him to your sister's debt until this morning. That was my failure. I should have investigated the original creditor more thoroughly when I cleared the debt." She looked at the fire too. "The letter implies he knows something about Clara," she said, "about the nature of her illness, something that could be used to damage her socially." "Yes," he said. "Lane told me the same. We believe we know what the information is. It is something that was handled badly in Shropshire, not by Clara and not by you, by a physician who should not have discussed the case with anyone and who was subsequently dismissed for exactly that breach." He paused. "It cannot harm her. We have the documentation that establishes the facts clearly. If Galt releases the story, the documentation contradicts it." She had not known about the documentation. "When did you obtain that?" she said. "Lane began acquiring it when the Essex claim first appeared," he said. "We did not know it would be relevant in this way. It simply seemed prudent." She sat with this. He had been managing Galt's Essex claim for 3 months. He had not mentioned it because it had not seemed connected to her. And now it was connected, and the thing that might have been her most private vulnerability was already contained, not because she had asked for it to be, but because he ran his affairs with the same thoroughness she ran hers, and their affairs had collided in a way that protected both of them. She felt something that was not quite relief and not quite something else. It was more complicated than either. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her. "You do not need to thank me," he said. "Galt was interfering with my household before he was interfering with yours. The resolution was already in motion." "Nevertheless," she said. She wanted to leave it there. She had planned to leave it there. She had a long habit of stopping at gratitude, of accepting resolution, and then returning to a position of self-sufficiency without admitting the size of what had just been set down. But she was tired, and the library was quiet, and he was sitting across from her with the fire between them and the whole improbable month behind them, and she found that she was not, at this particular moment, disposed to perform composure for an audience of one person who had never once required her to perform it. "I married you," she said, "for arithmetic. I told you that." "You did," he said. "And the arithmetic was right," she said. "The settlement was fair, the terms were clear, the calculation was sound." "Yes," he said, still looking at the fire. "I have been," she said, "telling myself that the arrangement was the whole of it, that the other things were incidental." She paused. "The dinner conversations, the evenings here, the book on the other armchair." She stopped. He looked at her. "They are not incidental," he said. "No," she said, "they are not." A silence in which the fire continued to do its work, and the clock on the mantelpiece did not seem to be moving at quite its normal pace. "I did not marry you for arithmetic," he said. "I know," she said, "I know that now." He looked at the fire for a moment more, then at his hands, then at her. "What do you want to do about Galt?" he said. She recognized the question for what it was, not a change of subject, a way of handing something back to her, not because he couldn't handle it, but because he understood that she would want to be part of handling it herself. "Lane's documentation," she said. "We release it first, before he releases anything. If the accurate information exists in public already, the story he has becomes worthless. He has nothing to threaten with if there is nothing to threaten." He nodded slowly. "Lane will know the proper channels." "I would like to speak to Lane directly," she said. "I'll arrange it," he said. She nodded. He did not move to leave, and she did not suggest that he should. They stayed by the fire, not talking after a while, just in the same room, the way they had been in the same room for the last 4 weeks of evenings, which had started as proximity and turned into something else, something that had its own warmth and its own weight, and which she had been naming in a column in her notebook for the last 3 weeks without writing the name down. She was going to write it down tonight. She thought that he probably knew what it said. She thought that she probably knew what it said too, and that the knowing was the beginning rather than the arrival, and that what came after the knowing was the part she had not yet worked out, because it was not in any calculation she had ever done before, and she was, for the first time in a very long time, content not to have the answer immediately. She would work it out. She always worked things out. But tonight she sat by the fire, and the room was warm, and the clock moved at its ordinary pace after all, and it was enough. The story appeared in the Gazette on a Thursday morning, and it was printed in the kind of type that meant the editor had decided it was important, and was not entirely wrong. The text was brief and comprehensive. It named the dare, it named the bet book, it named Edmund Crewe as the originator, and it reproduced almost in full the original wording of the terms as they had been entered into the White's register, including the phrase that had not been in any of the previous accounts, the description of the intended bride as a woman entirely without connections or consequence, suitable only as a demonstration of the absurdity of the proposition. The phrase was Crewe's. He had written it himself in his own hand in the bet book on the night of the dare. Ilara read it at breakfast. She read it standing, not because she had been surprised by the movement, but because she had stood up halfway through the paragraph and not sat back down, and it was only when she finished reading and set the paper on the table that she noticed she was still on her feet. She sat. She looked at the window. The garden was visible through the morning room glass, gray and still. Clara had a drawing of the East roses on the table near the door, half finished, that she had left the previous evening. Ilara looked at the drawing for a moment. Then she looked back at the paper. The phrase itself was not surprising. She had understood from the first morning of calls and the first Tuesday of London opinions that this was what the dare implied: unsuitable, without consequence, a joke. She had known the structure of it from the beginning and had made her decisions accordingly. But seeing it in print, in the formality of newsprint, in type that 12,000 people would read over breakfast, had a quality she had not anticipated. Not hurt exactly, something more precise than that. The feeling of a thing that had been theoretical becoming entirely actual, which was different from already knowing the thing in a way she could not have explained to anyone who had not experienced it themselves. She poured more tea. She was on her second cup when he came downstairs. He had the paper in his hand. He had clearly already read it. He came into the morning room and set it on the table and did not say anything for a moment. She looked at the paper and then at him. "It was Crewe," he said. "Yes," she said. "I have." He stopped. He sat down across from her. He looked at the paper with the particular expression she had learned to read in a month of watching him, the expression that meant he was choosing his words not because he was uncertain but because he was being precise. "I have not handled Crewe's involvement in this as well as I should have," he said. "The dare was my decision, the wording was his. I accepted the terms as written, without adequately considering what they would look like once they existed in the public record." "It was the middle of the night," she said, "in a club, after a significant amount of wine." "That is not an excuse," he said. "It is a fact, and facts are not always excuses." She looked at him. "It was also my decision," she said. "I could have refused." "You had 3 weeks until ruin," he said. "Yes," she said, "which means I had a choice under pressure, which is still a choice." He looked at her steadily. "You should not have to defend yourself against a phrase I accepted in a bet book," he said. "The phrase was about you. It was not a minor point in a document about property. It was about you specifically, and it was designed to be diminishing." She looked at her tea. "It was designed to be funny," she said, "at a club after midnight, by a man who wanted to see you refuse." "It was designed," he said, "to suggest that you were less than you are, and I signed the document." She was quiet for a moment. She thought about Crewe's face at the ball, watching them dance. The opera glasses at the opera, the words he had said to her near the ballroom wall, "He will grow bored." She thought about everything Edmund Crewe had done since the night at White's, and she thought about what all of it added up to, which was a man who had expected the arrangement to fail and had been progressively more uncomfortable watching it not fail. "What are you going to do?" she said. "I am going to go to Parliament," he said. "I have a committee sitting this morning. I will attend it in my usual seat and conduct my usual business, and I will not respond to the Gazette or to anything derived from it." She looked at him. "That is either a very good strategy," she said. "Or a very deliberate one," he said. He stood. "We will go to the theatre next Friday. The Duchess of Pembroke has a box. She will invite us. She will do it because she has been reconsidering, and reconsidering for the Duchess of Pembroke involves performing the conclusion publicly." "She is going to be kind," Alara said. "Formally kind," he said, "which in her case is the highest expression." He picked up the paper from the table and looked at the offending paragraph one more time, and the expression on his face was one she had not seen before. Very quiet, very deliberate, the face of a man who had decided something and was not in a hurry. He went to Parliament. By 2 in the afternoon, the story had a second chapter. Mr. Frederick Lane released the documentation about Clara's situation, complete, accurate, precise, arranged in a legal format that left no room for the kind of vague implication that Galt's letter had relied on. He sent it to 3 papers simultaneously. He also sent a copy directly to Galt, at his address in Essex, along with a note from the Duke's solicitors on the subject of Galt's property claim, which had not, as it turned out, been dropped but had been waiting for the appropriate moment to be addressed in full. That moment was now. By 4 in the afternoon, Crewe had not appeared at his club. By 5, 2 of the 3 lords who had witnessed the original bet were giving separate accounts of the wording's context to anyone who asked. Both accounts happened to emphasize that the language had been Crewe's, that the Duke had signed without particular attention to the precise phrasing, and that the entire occasion had been, as one of them put it, a great deal less formal than any newspaper might suggest. By the time he returned at 5:30, 3 separate people had sent Alara flowers. Not her husband, her name on the cards, the Duchess of Ashford at Ashford House. Lady Constance sent roses. A second arrangement arrived from a woman she had met only once, at a morning call early in the month, who had been kind and whom she had remembered for exactly that reason. The third was from someone she did not know, a card that said only in a clean hand, well handled, no name. She was in the morning room, looking at the 3 arrangements when he came in. He looked at the flowers. He looked at her. 3, he said. 3, she said. He sat across from her and looked at the flowers again, and something in his expression was not quite readable, which was unusual, because she had spent a month learning to read him. In all the ways this has not gone as planned, he said slowly. The ways that it has, he stopped, started again. I did not expect the month to go this way. Neither did I, she said. The 40 minutes, he said, the negotiation. I signed a document that contained a phrase I should have contested. I did not contest it because I was not thinking about the document. I was thinking about, he stopped again. About, she said. He looked at her. About the woman who asked what the settlement was before she asked anything else, he said, and who had conditions, and who argued about Hobbs at dinner, and who moved the desk. He paused. I was thinking about a person, not a document, and that was correct, and the unsigned phrase was not, and I am not sure how to, a beat. I am not practiced at this. She looked at him. He was not practiced at it. She had known that for weeks. He was a man who had been carrying things alone in a cold house for 3 years, and he was standing in the morning room looking at 3 arrangements of flowers that people had sent to her, and he had the expression of a man who is arriving at something and is not certain of the terrain. You went to Parliament, she said. Yes, he said. In your usual seat, she said, and you did your usual work. Yes, he said. That was, she said carefully, exactly right. He looked at her for a long moment. And the flowers, he said. The flowers, she said, are because people are beginning to form a different opinion. Of you, he said. Of us, she said. He was quiet. Then he said, I am going to call on Crewe tomorrow. She nodded. I'll come with you, she said. He looked at her. No, he said, this one is mine. She considered this and decided he was right. She did not ask what happened when he went. He did not tell her. He returned the following afternoon with the same expression he had worn when he left, unhurried and deliberate, and he said only that Crewe had been at home, and that the visit had been brief, and that certain matters had been resolved. Edmund Crewe did not appear in public for 11 days. When he did, he was at a dinner on the other side of town from Ashford House, and by the account of a reliable observer, Lady Constance, who was everywhere, he seemed considerably smaller than he had in September. Alara did not think about him particularly after that. She had other things to think about. The column in her notebook had a name now, and the name had weight, and weight was something she had learned to carry, and learning to carry a new weight meant first acknowledging that you were carrying it. She was carrying it. She thought he was too. A key fell out of a book on a Wednesday afternoon in November, and it landed on the morning room floor with the small ringing sound of metal on wood, and Alara looked at it for a long time before she picked it up. She had been sorting through a stack of books that had been brought down from the upstairs room where they had been stored without particular order since what she understood to be about 3 years ago. It was a quiet task, the kind she preferred for afternoons when she wanted to think without appearing to think. She catalogued and arranged, and let her mind move beneath the surface of the work. The book from which the key fell was a collection of letters, old ones, correspondence between 2 historical figures she did not immediately recognize. The key was small and old, brass, the kind that belongs to a personal lock rather than a room lock. She looked at it. She knew what it opened. She had known since the 3rd week, when she had stood in the hall and watched him stand outside the locked door on the 2nd floor. She had not asked about it because she had made a decision at the beginning about the space she would occupy and the space she would leave alone. She had moved desks and reorganized bookshelves and changed curtains and rearranged the dining table, and all of that was the space she was allowed. The locked room was not. She set the key on the desk. She looked at it for the rest of the afternoon. That evening at dinner, it sat in her mind like a stone in a shoe, present without being the thing she was attending to, but making itself known in every step. He was quiet at dinner in the way that meant he was thinking rather than absent, which she had learned to distinguish from quiet that meant the opposite. She did not push the conversation in any direction. She talked about a letter she had received from Lady Constance about a charitable committee that Lady Constance had invited her to join, which she had decided to accept. She talked about Clara, who had been invited to a small gathering of young women by one of the housemaid's cousins, which was not a grand social occasion, but was an occasion, and Clara had worn her nicest dress and come back with her eyes bright. He listened. He asked one or two questions, real ones, not the polite questions that contain their own answers. After dinner she said, "A key fell out of a book this afternoon." He looked at her. "A brass one," she said, "small, old. I left it on the desk in the morning room." He was still. "I didn't use it," she said. "I don't intend to use it without knowing what you want to do with it." He looked at the table. The fire moved, the clock moved. The house was around them with its particular autumn quality, the kind of warmth that knows winter is coming and is holding itself carefully. "Henry," he said, then he stopped. She waited. He said Henry's death was reported as a riding accident. She held very still. "It was not a riding accident," he said. He said it in the same tone he used for factual statements, but his hand on the table had closed around nothing, fingers curled loosely, the way someone holds a thing that isn't there. He struggled with things that he could not always name. "We thought it was improving. We were wrong." He paused. "I was wrong. I did not see it clearly enough, and then I couldn't. There was nothing to do." She did not say anything. "The story," he said, "was my father's decision made in the first week before I had the title, when I was still before I understood what the arrangement meant. My father said the truth would damage the family's name and Henry's name equally, and that Henry had loved the family and would not have wanted that." He looked at the fire. "I have been maintaining it ever since. Everything in that room is his books, his letters, there are his journals. I have not read them. I have been managing the maintenance of a story about a man whose private life I kept locked in a room and tried not to think about." She listened to all of it. When he was done, she said, "You are not responsible for his death." He looked at her. "I know that," he said. Intellectually, he looked back at the fire. "The rest of it takes longer." She understood this precisely. "The story that was told," she said, "does it harm him?" He considered this. "No, it presents him as fortunate, a good writer who had a bad day. People remember him kindly under it." "Then it is not the worst decision your father made," she said. He looked at her. "No," he said slowly, "it isn't." "The room," she said, "the journals, what do you want to do with them?" He was quiet for a long time. "I don't know yet," he said. "Then we don't do anything yet," she said. "The key will be where I left it. When you're ready." He looked at her with the unguarded expression, the one that came over him sometimes and had been coming more often in recent weeks, the one that was not the Duke's face but something underneath it, the actual person, the one who had signed a bet book in the middle of the night because he needed a reason to act. "You said we," he said. She looked at him. "I said we," she confirmed. He did not say anything for a moment. "Then you knew about the room." "Since the third week," she said. "I saw you outside it." "You didn't ask." "It wasn't mine to ask about," she said. "Not then." "And now," he said. She looked at him. "Now," she said, "I think it might be, a little." Another silence, different from the ones earlier. The kind that holds more than it appears to. He said very quietly, "His maps were in the morning room." "I moved them to the library," she said, "the middle shelf, south windows, with his other things." "I know," he said, "I found them." She nodded. "He would have liked you enormously," he said, not for the first time. But this time he said it in a different register, not the careful testing of earlier weeks but something confirmed, something he had decided was true and was now simply saying. "You've said that before," she said. "It's still true," he said, "more true now than when I said it the first time." She looked at her hands. "I would have liked him," she said, "I think." "Yes," he said, "he was easy to like, harder to understand. He made everything complicated, and then convinced you the complication was worth it." She raised her eyes. He was looking at the fire. but she had the impression he was looking at something further away than the fire, something inside the shape of the sentence he had just said. She said nothing. She let the sentence sit. He let it sit too. After a while she said, "Are you going to read the journals?" A long pause. "Eventually," he said, "when I can sit with whatever is in them without, when I can do it without the room being a place I lock rather than a place I go." She nodded. "I will not go into that room without you," she said, "whatever you decide." He looked at her. "That is," he said, and then he stopped, and then he continued, "a more considerable thing than it sounds." "Yes," she said, "I know." They stayed by the fire for a long time that evening. They did not talk about the room again. They talked about other things, the committee, the bill currently before the Lords, a novel she had been reading that he had also read years ago and had opinions about that he had been withholding. She suspected, for no reason except that he was not accustomed to having someone to share them with. When she finally went to bed, she left her book on the arm of the chair. His was already on the arm of his chair, which meant he had come back to the library after she went upstairs, or had left it there before dinner. She was not certain which. Both possibilities seemed to her like evidence of the same thing. She went upstairs. She wrote in her notebook, the column with the name. She had been adding to it for weeks. Tonight she wrote one more line, and then she looked at what she had written, the full accumulation of it, the dinners and the fire and the unguarded expressions and the armchairs and the maps on the library shelf and the way he had said "we" before she said it and the roses along the east wall and the arbor that would bloom in June. She looked at all of it. She closed the notebook. She knew what she was going to do about it. She was going to wait until she was ready, and when she was ready she was going to tell him, not in the column in the notebook but in the actual room with the actual fire between them, in her own words, without calculation. She had been certain of many things in her life through calculation. She wanted to be certain of this one through something else. She turned out the light. Outside, London was doing what it always did at this hour, going about its business without particular concern for the people inside its houses who were working out the things that mattered. She went to sleep. The documents appeared on the breakfast table on a Monday morning. She saw them before she sat down. They were in a neat stack beside her plate, which was where Mr. Lane sometimes left correspondence for her attention, and she reached for them with the automatic gesture of someone beginning a morning's work. Then she read the heading. She set them down. She picked up her tea and held it without drinking and looked at the documents from a distance of about 18 inches. They were legal specific. They outlined in the careful language of solicitors a course of action that would effectively dissolve the marriage. The grounds were precise. The timeline was clear. The financial provisions outlined within them were thorough in the way of a person who had thought hard about this. Clara's situation fully secured, Ilara's own future financed independently of the marriage, a position in society that would not be entirely undone by the dissolution, because the terms of the exit were arranged to be quiet and uncontested and mutually dignified. Every debt addressed, every vulnerability covered, every door left open. She put the tea down. She looked at the door of the morning room. He would have left before she came down. He always left early on Mondays. It was his habit, established before she arrived and maintained since. He would be at his solicitor's office by now, or at the Lord's, or at his club. She sat. She read the documents again, more slowly. They were, she recognized, a consideration, not a demand, not even a strong suggestion. They were structured as an option being placed before her. All the provisions ran one direction, everything flowed to protect her and Clara. There was no comparable section addressing his own position because his own position did not need addressing. He was a duke. His position was the baseline from which everything else was measured. He had done this carefully. He had done it generously. He had done it, she thought, because he was a man who had spent 3 years believing he was best handled alone, and who had decided, somewhere in the space of the last 7 weeks, that he did not want to trap someone in the arrangement that trapping had caused. He was trying to give her a way out. She sat with the documents for a long time. She was not going to pretend, even to herself, that she did not understand what this cost him. She had been watching him for 7 weeks, which was not a long time in some measures and was an enormous amount of time in others, and she had learned to read him with the specific precision of someone who has been paying extremely close attention, and she understood what the production of these documents had required. It would have required him to sit at a desk and compose an instruction to his solicitors that contained the phrase "dissolve the marriage." It would have required him to arrange, provision by provision, for a future that did not include her in it. It would have required him to choose to give her the option of leaving over the option of staying, when giving her the option was the harder of the two things to do. He had done it because he thought it was right. She had enormous respect for this. She also thought he was wrong. She folded the documents along their existing creases. She placed them at his seat, not at hers. She ate her breakfast. She had almost finished when she heard the front door. She looked up. Mr. Lane appeared in the morning room doorway. "His Grace returned, Your Grace. He left something at the house this morning that he needed." "Yes," she said, "I imagine he did." She heard his footsteps in the hall, heard them pause outside the morning room. A pause in which she imagined him seeing the light under the door and calculating. He came in. He looked at the table. He looked at the folded documents at his seat. He looked at her. She was still sitting. She had not moved from her chair, which was her chair now in the way that everything at this table was now in its right position. His seat was at the corner to her right. The long, empty middle of the table behind them was a thing they had fixed 5 weeks ago. "You've been at the solicitor's already," she said. "Lane took them this morning," he said. He was standing by the door. He had not come to the table yet. "You did not tell me you were considering this," she said. "No," he said. "Why?" He looked at her steadily. "Because it wasn't a consideration I was certain I could present to you without making it seem as though I was asking you to leave, when I was trying to do the opposite." "The opposite," she said. "The opposite," he said. "I was trying to make sure you could stay if you wanted to without you being here because the arrangement requires it and not because you, he stopped. He looked at the table. "I am not practiced at this." "You have said that before," she said. "It remains true," he said. She looked at the folded documents at his seat. "Sit down," she said. He came to the table and sat, not at the far end, not at a formal distance. At his chair, the corner from her right, which was where he always sat now. He did not look at the documents. "You forgot," she said. He looked at her. "You forgot," she said again, "that I am also a practical person." She looked at him directly, with the same directness that had been hers since the first night, since the doorway on Cavendish Lane, since the negotiation. "And practically speaking, I find I would rather not." He went still. Not the stillness of absence, the stillness of attention. "You find," he began. "I find," she said, "that the arrangement was never only an arrangement. I find that I have been writing that in a notebook for approximately 5 weeks and have been considering when to say it plainly." She looked at him. "I am saying it now because you put documents at my plate, and they were the most generous thing anyone has done for me in a very long time, and I need you to know that I am not using the documents." He looked at her for a long moment. She held the look. "The column," he said slowly, "in your notebook." She blinked. "You've seen the notebook." "Once," he said, briefly. "I was not reading it. I was returning it. You left it in the library. I set it on the table and it fell open and I saw," he stopped. "I saw the header of a column, not what was in the column." He paused. "I could not read the header." "You saw the header," she said. "Yes." "And you arranged the documents," she said slowly, "after you saw the header." He was quiet. "George," she said. It was the first time she had used his name. His actual name, not the title, not the address of a woman managing a household. His name. He looked at her with the unguarded expression, the fullest version of it, the one she had been watching approach for 7 weeks. "The header," she said, "is not a question." He said nothing for a moment. "Then what is it?" She looked at him. "It is the answer," she said, "to a question I had at the beginning about what the other things were. The dinner conversations, the evenings in the library, the roses in spring." She held his eyes. "I told myself they were incidental to the arrangement. The header is the word for why they are not." He was very still. "What is the word?" he said. It came out quietly, with the quality of a question asked by someone who already knows the answer and needs to hear it said properly. She told him. She said it plainly in the morning room, at the table that was now in its right arrangement, with the breakfast dishes between them and the documents folded and returned, and the light from the window that she had put in the right position falling across the space between their hands. She said it, and then she looked at the window for a moment, because she had said the actual thing, not the calculated version, not the version that left room for retreat, and her composure was fine, she was fine, but she needed one breath before she looked back at him. She looked back at him. He had the expression he had worn when he laughed and was surprised by it, and when he said the word the opera house, and when he found the map book on the library shelf. But larger than those, bigger, the face of a man who has been carrying something alone for a very long time and has just found with considerable shock that someone is offering to help carry it. He said the word too. Not the same word but arriving from a different direction, with different weight and different history behind it, which meant it was, when they said it, not the same word at all but the same thing. The morning room was very quiet. Outside the window, London was doing its Monday morning work. Inside, neither of them said anything for a while. And then he reached across the corner of the table, not dramatically, not with any performance, simply with the straightforward movement of a man who has decided to stop leaving the chair at the angle that made it easy to remove, and his hand was beside hers on the white tablecloth. She looked at their hands. She turned hers. The document stayed folded at his seat. They were not going to be needed. Mr. Lane, who passed the morning room door on his way to the study 10 minutes later, noted the configuration through the half-open door and made a mental adjustment to the various calculations he had been quietly running since October, and continued on his way without interrupting. 6 months after a Wednesday night in October, the Duke and Duchess of Ashford walked into the opening session of Parliament. They walked slowly, not the slow walk of ceremony, which she had learned the mechanics of over the course of 6 months of public appearances. This was the slower movement of two people who have somewhere to be and are not in a hurry about it, which is the particular luxury of people who have arrived somewhere in their private lives and find that the public portion of their day is therefore manageable rather than threatening. The hall was full. It was always full at the opening session. The accumulated pomp of centuries, the formal procession, the speeches, the various lordships in their various finery. She had attended once before in March as a newcomer who was still being assessed. This was different. This time she was simply there. She wore grey silk with her mother's brooch at the shoulder, small and plain and exactly right, the kind of choice that people with taste recognized immediately, and people without taste did not notice at all, which she had decided long ago was the ideal arrangement for any adornment. He was beside her in his formal coat, which fit him the way his ordinary coats did, well without appearing to care, and which he had put on that morning with the specific efficiency of a man who dressed quickly, because the getting dressed was never the point. They had argued at breakfast. Not badly, not angrily, but with the particular energy of two people who disagree on something that matters to both of them. The subject was a bill before the Lords about property rights and inheritance law, which he thought was inadequate, and she thought was inadequate for different reasons, and they had been 20 minutes into the argument before either of them had eaten anything. She had enjoyed every minute of it. She still thought he was wrong about the secondary clause. He still thought she was wrong about the precedent. Neither of them had changed position by the time the carriage arrived, which suited them both. The hall rearranged itself when they entered. She knew the signs now, had known them since the Haverton ball, since the opera, since the first morning of calls. The subtle shift of weight, the slight redirection, the conversations that continued but added a secondary awareness. She moved through it as she moved through everything now, with her full attention present and a very settled sense of where she stood. She stood here. She had arrived in London 6 months ago with 3 cases and an impossible number of closed doors, and she had walked through one that opened at 1 in the morning at the hand of a man who had been bored and whose brother had loved maps, and she had negotiated 40 minutes in a sitting room by a low fire, and she had been a duchess since before 3 in the morning of a Thursday in late October. She had moved a desk and reorganized a bookshelf and changed curtains and rearranged a dining table and opened a morning room that had been closed for 3 years, and sorted a map book onto the right shelf, and sat by a fire every evening for 6 months, and eaten dinner at the corner of a table that could seat 20. She had read 200 letters from people who had opinions. She had answered perhaps 40 of them. She had sat on Lady Constance's charitable committee and found that it contained 3 of the most interesting women in London, who had been interesting all along and had simply been sitting in rooms that the Ton found unremarkable, which was its own education. She had spoken twice with Mrs. Farrow about the household arrangements in a way that was now simply a conversation between 2 women who respected each other's competence, which had taken approximately 3 weeks, exactly as he had predicted. She had stood outside the locked room on the 2nd floor and held the key and waited. He had opened it in February. She had been with him. She had sat in the chair by the window of his brother's room while he read through the journals, not quickly, over several evenings, and she had been present without intruding, and there had been evenings when he read in silence and evenings when he read something and said quietly what it was, and once he laughed at something Henry had written and she laughed too, and the room, which had been sealed and cold for 3 years, was warm. They had not closed it again after that. It was simply a room now. Across the parliamentary hall, she located Edmund Crewe. He was standing with a group of older lords near the south colonnade. He was speaking, which meant he had recovered from the 11 days which she had expected. He was a man who would always recover because recovery was what men of his type did, and she was not interested in his defeat, which would have been temporary anyway. She was interested in the fact that he looked across the hall and saw her, and did not hold the look. That was enough. "Crewe," she said to the Duke very quietly. "I see him," he said. "He's fine," she said. "He will always be fine," he said, with a tone that contained neither admiration nor bitterness, simply the accuracy of someone describing weather. Men like Crewe land on their feet because they are made of the same material as the ground. She almost laughed. She had learned when to contain it and when not to bother, and the calculation was based entirely on the setting. In a formal hall at the opening of Parliament, containment. He leaned toward her and said something near her ear. It was about the secondary clause, which he had apparently not stopped thinking about. It was also, structurally, a concession, the specific kind of half-concession he made when he had reconsidered something and was not going to announce this directly, but was instead restating the position in a way that incorporated what she had said. She recognized this. She had learned his concession style in February. She tilted her head. "I told you about the precedent," she said. "You mentioned the precedent," he said. "I have since looked into it. And he said carefully, "You were not wrong about it." She said nothing. He said, "That is as far as that goes." "Of course," she said. Above them, in the visitors' gallery, there were a handful of observers allowed by various means of arrangement. She was distantly aware of people looking down at the floor below with the particular attention of people who have positioned themselves to watch something. She was aware of Clara up there somewhere, having been permitted through the offices of Lady Constance, because Lady Constance could arrange most things if she felt the arrangement was worth making. She was aware of 3 young lords near the entrance who were looking at her, and the Duke with the open, observational interest of men who were still in the stage of watching the world rather than participating in it, which was a stage she remembered from certain dinner parties in Shropshire, and which she felt a distant fondness for. She was not particularly aware of herself. This was, she recognized, a new condition. She had spent 6 weeks in London before October in a constant state of awareness of herself relative to everything around her, which space she was allowed to occupy, which room, which conversation, which tier of the social arrangement. It had been exhausting, and she had managed it because exhausting things were managed if they needed to be managed. Now she was simply here, in a hall at the opening of Parliament, in grey silk with her mother's brooch and sensible shoes and the particular quality of presence that she had always had and had simply not had the standing to use. She had the standing now, not because of the title exactly, though the title was the mechanism, but because 6 months of being exactly herself in an arrangement that had no template had produced, somewhat to her surprise, a woman who knew precisely where the edges of the thing were and did not particularly mind them. The session began. He went to his seat. She went to the gallery, not to the visitors' section, but to the separate area designated for the duchesses and senior ladies, where she sat beside Lady Constance, who greeted her with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose predictions have been confirmed. "You look well," Lady Constance said. "I am well," she said. Lady Constance looked at the floor below at the Assembly of Lords. She looked at the Duke of Ashford in his seat, which he occupied with his usual quality of being present somewhere only when he had decided to be. "He looks well too," Lady Constance said. "He is well," she said. "Good," Lady Constance said, with the briskness of someone closing a file. The session proceeded. Below, a young lord in the gallery's observers section. He had been watching the Duke's box at the opera in October, and had written something in his journal that night that he had shown to no one. Looked down at the parliamentary floor and at the gallery and at the grey silk figure in the upper tier, and he thought about what he had written and found it was still accurate. He had written, "The Duke of Ashford looked punished." Looking now from a different angle, 6 months later, he added a second line in his head that he would write when he got home. The second line was, "And the Duchess looks as though she has always been here." The session ran for 3 hours. She paid attention to all of it, because it was relevant and she intended to be relevant to it, and afterwards she and the Duke found each other in the general movement of the hall's dispersal, which happened by some arrangement of habits that had developed over 6 months, and was now simply the way they moved, toward the same exit without having discussed it. In the carriage home, she returned to the secondary clause. He returned to the precedent. They disagreed productively for the 12 minutes of the journey, and when the carriage stopped and they went inside, the house was warm in the way of a house that is properly maintained and properly inhabited, and Mr. Lane met them in the hall with 2 pieces of correspondence, and Clara appeared at the top of the stairs to tell Ilara what she had been able to see from the gallery, which was apparently everything, and the house was full of sound. He stood in the hall and let the house be full around him. She was halfway up the stairs, listening to Clara, when she looked back at him. He was looking at her, not with the expression of the first evening, which had been careful and deliberate and managing, not with the expression of the early dinners, which had been cautious in the way of someone who had not yet decided how much territory to give, with something else entirely, with the quiet, settled look of a man who is standing in the right place and knows it, and does not intend to let it be reduced to anything smaller than it is. She held the look. Then Clara was telling her about the 3rd row of the gallery and the excellent view, and she turned back to her sister, and behind her she heard him speak to Mr. Lane in the normal domestic register of an evening arriving at its ordinary rhythms. She smiled at Clara. She did not think about the dare particularly. She thought about it sometimes, the way you think about the thing that set a particular chain in motion, with the detached interest of retrospection rather than the weight of the event itself. A man bored at midnight in a club, a wager with a man who wanted to see him fail, a carriage moving through the dark streets toward a woman who answered the door and asked immediately what the settlement was. It was a beginning that looked like a joke. It had not been a joke. It had been the most precise thing she had ever negotiated, and she had negotiated it in 40 minutes in a sitting room with a low fire and a vicar by the door and the full weight of what she needed on one side of the scale and the full weight of what he could offer on the other, and the scale had been balanced, and she had signed her name beside his. And then, because some arithmetic comes out differently than you predicted, and the difference is better rather than worse, the 40 minutes had become 6 months, and the 6 months had become a household and a morning room desk in the right position, and a library armchair, and a key and a room that was simply a room now, and the secondary clause of a bill before the Lords and the roses along the east wall that would bloom in late June. She took Clara's arm and went up the stairs. Below, the house continued around its ordinary evening, and outside, London continued around its ordinary purposes, and the Duke's voice carried from the hall where he was speaking to Mr. Lane about the correspondence, and the sound of it moved through the house with the easy authority of a man who lived here and knew it and had, in the course of 6 months of dinners and arguments and evenings by a fire, arrived at the conclusion that knowing it was no longer something he had to do alone. The column in her notebook was full. She did not need to add to it. She knew what it said.